Hey guys, in today's video, I'm going to bring you a story that will challenge everything you believe about life and death. Prepare to meet Cyrus Blackwood, an atheist doctor who, after years of skepticism, was drawn into a near-death experience during a rafting accident. But the most surprising thing is that, in this moment of despair, he discovered a dark secret about none other than Queen Elizabeth. In hell. What he saw on the other side will change his vision forever. So, before we start, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss any content like this. Now, get ready for this shocking revelation that will leave you speechless. My name is Cyrus Blackwood, and I am a man of science to the core. At age 45, I dedicated my life to forensic neuropathology, a fascinating field that allows me to unravel the mysteries of the human brain after death. For years, I saw life and death as mere biological processes, nothing more than chemical reactions and nerve synapses. My confidence in scientific explanations was unshakable, and I saw no reason to question this view. My wife, Evangeline, has always been the opposite of me in this regard. As a spiritual psychologist, she spends hours talking about dimensions beyond the physical, about how souls don't die, they just transform. I confess that, for a long time, I considered this mere fantasy. Cyrus, there's so much more to life than you can see with your instruments, she used to tell me. But I, in my scientific arrogance, didn't listen. For years, I lived comfortably in my skepticism. My career flourished. I published articles in renowned magazines and became a reference in my field. I believed I had all the answers, or at least the tools to find them. The idea of something beyond what could be measured, weighed, or observed under a microscope seemed absurd to me. I was the typical skeptical scientist, always ready to dismiss any explanation that didn't fit into my materialist paradigm. I remember heated debates with Evangeline, where I gently ridiculed her beliefs, always with an air of intellectual superiority. "Honey, if it can't be proven in a lab, it just doesn't exist," I would say. Little did I know that my worldview was about to be turned upside down. A simple rafting trip on the Arkansas River would become the catalyst for an experience that would challenge everything I believed I knew about life, death, and the very nature of reality. This is the story of how I, an inveterate skeptic, was forced to question my deepest convictions and consider possibilities that I would previously have dismissed as absurd. Since I was a child, I have carried with me a deep and irrational fear of water. It all started when I was just 8 years old, during a family trip to the beach. I remember the day vividly. The sun was shining, the sea was calm, and I, eager to play in the waves, ran towards the water. However, I underestimated the strength of the sea. An unexpected wave knocked me over, and for a few terrifying seconds, I was submerged, struggling to find the surface. Although I was quickly rescued by my father, those brief moments of panic left an indelible mark on my psyche. Since then, the idea of being submerged filled me with paralyzing terror. Pools, lakes, even full bathtubs made me uncomfortable. Over the years, I learned to disguise this fear, but it was always there, hidden in the shadows of my mind. Evangeline, with her characteristic sensitivity, always noticed this apprehension. She tried to encourage me to face this fear, suggesting swimming lessons or short boat trips. But I always found excuses, hiding behind work or other commitments. Deep down, I knew I was allowing this fear to control a significant part of my life. It was with great surprise that my family received my acceptance when Evangeline suggested a rafting trip in Colorado. "It will be an opportunity to face your fears, Cyrus," she said with an encouraging smile. At that moment, driven by a desire to prove to myself that I could overcome this phobia, I agreed. After all, I was a rational man, and irrational fears should have no place in my life. In the days leading up to the trip, I alternated between moments of determination and growing anxiety. I sought refuge in my work, immersing myself in analyses and reports as if they could protect me from what was to come. At night, I dreamed of turbulent waters and relentless currents, but every morning I reaffirmed my decision. "It's just water," I repeated to myself. controlled and monitored by experienced professionals. Little did I know that this trip would be much more than a challenge to my fear of water. It would be a journey that would take me to the limits of life and death, challenging everything I believed I knew about existence. If I had known what was coming, I would never have gotten into that boat. But fate, or something beyond, had other plans for me. The day of our rafting trip dawned with cloudy skies and a cold breeze that seemed to foreshadow the events to come. We arrived early at the starting point, where we met up with our guide, a burly man named Mike with years of experience on the river. As he instructed us on safety procedures, I felt my heart racing, but I struggled to maintain a calm appearance. "The water level is a little high today," Mike commented casually, "but nothing we can't handle." His words, which should have been reassuring, only increased my apprehension. I looked at Evangeline and our children, all excited about the adventure that awaited us, and forced a smile. I didn't want my fear to ruin the family's day. We donned our life jackets and helmets, and were soon in the raft, sailing through the initially calm waters of the Arkansas River. The first few minutes were almost pleasant. The fresh air, the sound of the water, the wild beauty around us. For a moment, I forgot my fear and allowed myself to enjoy the experience. But as we progressed downstream, the current became stronger. The banks of the river seemed to pass faster and faster, and the sound of the water turned into a deafening roar. Mike shouted instructions, but his voice barely rose above the roar of the rapids. Suddenly we rounded a bend and were faced with a sequence of rapids that seemed far more intense than anything we had faced so far. The boat bounced and turned, thrown from side to side by the force of the water. I held on with all my strength, my knuckles white with tension. That's when it happened. A particularly strong wave hit the side of the boat, lifting it almost vertically. For a surreal moment, I saw the world spin around me. I heard my family's screams mixed with the roar of the water, and then, in an instant, I was thrown out of the boat. The shock of the cold water was like a punch in the gut. Within seconds, I was swept away from the boat, the current pulling me as if I weighed nothing. I fought desperately to keep my head above water, but every breath was a challenge. The force of the river was relentless, slamming me against submerged rocks and pulling me under. In the midst of the chaos, a terrible thought occurred to me. This is how I'm going to die. The fear that had haunted me my entire life was about to come true. As I struggled against the current, I felt my strength slipping away. The last thing I saw before I was pulled under was Evangeline's terrified face, screaming my name from the edge of the boat. Then everything went dark. The feeling of being dragged into the depths of the river is something that words can hardly describe. The pressure of the water increased with each second, compressing my chest and making it even more difficult to fight for air. My lungs burned, begging for oxygen, as my mind screamed in panic. Strangely, in the midst of all this chaos, a clear thought emerged. So this is what it feels like to die. As a neuropathologist, I had studied the process of death countless times, but experiencing it was something else entirely. Part of my brain, even in that moment of extreme danger, seemed to clinically observe what was happening. I fought the current with all the strength I had left, but it was a losing battle. Gradually, I felt my movements slow, my muscles exhausted from the lack of oxygen. The urge to breathe was overwhelming, but I knew that giving in to the urge would mean the end. It was then that something unexpected happened. The panic that gripped me began to dissipate, replaced by a strange sense of calm. It was as if my body had accepted its fate, even though my mind was still struggling. I remembered reading about this sensation in near-death reports, but I had always dismissed them as delusions caused by a lack of oxygen to the brain. As consciousness began to slip away from me, flashbacks of my life flashed before my eyes. I saw Evangeline on our wedding day, the birth of our children, moments of triumph in my career, but I also saw the moments I wasted, the times I was arrogant or insensitive, especially toward Evangeline's beliefs. The cold water that had once terrified me now seemed to envelop me in an almost comforting embrace. The pain and discomfort began to disappear, replaced by a feeling of lightness. Part of me knew this was the end, that my brain was shutting down, but another part felt curiously at peace. Then, just when I thought it was all over, something changed. The darkness that enveloped me began to give way to a faint light. It wasn't a light coming from a specific direction, but it seemed to emanate from everywhere at once. It was soft, welcoming, unlike anything I had ever experienced. At that moment, I felt like I was being pulled out of my body. The feeling of weight, of being stuck in the water, completely disappeared. It was as if I were floating, free from physical limitations. The light around me grew brighter and brighter, but somehow it wasn't blinding. On the contrary, it was comforting, almost maternal. In the midst of this surreal experience, I had a clear and disturbing thought. This shouldn't be happening. As a scientist, I have always believed that death was the absolute end of consciousness. There was no room in my worldview for post-death experiences or anything similar. Yet here I was, seemingly conscious, experiencing something that defied everything I believed I knew. As the light completely enveloped me, I felt a deep, inexplicable peace. All the fears, worries, and pains of earthly life seemed insignificant compared to this feeling of completeness. For the first time in my life, I truly felt at home. As I floated in this state of peace and lightness, I began to notice that the light around me was not static. It pulsed and moved, as if it were alive. Colors I had never seen before danced at the edges of my perception, creating complex, beautiful patterns that seemed to contain deep meanings I couldn't fully comprehend. At that moment, I had the distinct sensation of being on the threshold between two worlds. On the one hand, I still felt a tenuous connection to my physical body, like an invisible thread connecting me to the life I knew. On the other, I felt drawn to something beyond, a reality vaster and deeper than anything I had ever experienced. It was then that I realized I was not alone in this ethereal space. Presences, which I cannot describe as physical forms, but as distinct consciousnesses, seemed to surround me. I didn't see them with my eyes, but I felt them in a way that transcended the physical senses. These presences emanated a sense of ancient wisdom and infinite compassion. One of these presences seemed to approach me. There were no words spoken, but somehow I understood that I was being asked to make a choice. I could return to my body, my life as I knew it, or I could move on to whatever lay beyond that luminous threshold. In that moment of decision, I was overcome with a sudden and overwhelming realization. I saw my entire life not as a series of linear events, but as an interconnected whole. Every choice, every interaction, every moment of joy or sadness was part of a larger pattern, the meaning of which I was just beginning to glimpse. I saw how my skepticism, although based on a genuine desire to understand the world, had blinded me to other forms of knowledge and experience. I saw the times I had dismissed Evangeline's ideas not because they were invalid, but because they challenged my carefully constructed worldview. This revelation filled me with a mixture of regret and gratitude. Regret for missed opportunities for growth and understanding, and gratitude for the chance to see things from a new perspective. As I contemplated this monumental choice, I felt a force pulling me back. It was as if invisible strings were tied to my essence, calling me back to the physical world. I heard distant voices, echoes of concern and love that I recognized as my family. At that moment, I understood that my journey was not over yet. There were lessons to learn, relationships to heal, a life to live with new understanding. With a mix of reluctance and determination, I felt myself being pulled back across the threshold, leaving behind the comforting light and wise presences that surrounded me. The transition back was abrupt and disorienting. The feeling of peace and universal understanding was quickly replaced by the raw physical reality of the Arkansas River. The shock of returning to physical consciousness was overwhelming. Suddenly, the peace and understanding I had experienced was replaced by the harsh reality of my body fighting to survive. The icy water of the Arkansas River enveloped me again, and the panic I had left behind returned with a vengeance. My lungs burned, desperate for air. Instinctively, I began to fight the current, my arms and legs moving frantically. It was like my body knew what to do, even though my mind was still confused about the transition. Suddenly, my head broke the surface of the water. The cold air hit my face, and I gasped, pulling oxygen into my desperate lungs. The sunlight, which had once seemed so ordinary, now blinded me with its intensity. Every sensation was amplified: the roar of the water, the biting cold, the metallic taste in my mouth. As I struggled to stay afloat, I heard distant screams. Turning my head with difficulty, I saw a rescue boat approaching quickly. Strong hands grabbed me, pulling me out of the turbulent water. When I finally found myself lying in the bottom of the boat, shaking and coughing, the reality of what had happened began to hit me. The paramedics on board immediately began examining me, checking my vitals and wrapping me in thermal blankets. Their voices seemed distant, as if I were still partially in that other place. I heard snippets of their conversation, something about me being underwater for several minutes, about it being a miracle I was alive. As I was carried to shore, my eyes desperately searched for my family. That's when I saw Evangeline running towards me, tears streaming down her face. Our children followed closely behind, their faces a mix of fear and relief. When Evangeline finally reached me, gripping my hand tightly, I felt a wave of emotion wash over me. "Cyrus," she sobbed, "we thought we lost you." His voice shook, filled with fear and relief. I tried to speak, to tell her that I was okay, that I had experienced something beyond understanding, but my throat was raw and the words wouldn't come out. As I was transferred to an ambulance, my mind fluctuated between the physical world around me and the vivid memories of the experience I had just had. Part of me desperately wanted to share what I had experienced, to explain how my worldview had been completely transformed in a matter of minutes. Or was it hours? Time seemed to have lost its meaning. However, looking at the worried faces of my family and the paramedics focused on ensuring my physical stability, I realized this was not the time. There was a lot to process, a lot to understand, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I didn't have all the answers. In fact, I now had more questions than I ever had. As the ambulance sped toward the hospital, I closed my eyes, exhausted. The adrenaline was beginning to wane, leaving me with a mixture of physical pain and a profound sense of inner change. I knew that when I woke up again, nothing would be the same. My journey back to life was just beginning, and with it, a search to understand what I had experienced and how it would change my life going forward. The days following my near-death experience were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions and sensations. Physically, my body was exhausted, struggling to recover from the trauma of nearly drowning. The doctors at the hospital were surprised by my quick recovery, considering how long I spent underwater. They spoke in terms of a medical miracle, a phrase that before I would have dismissed as sensationalism, but which now resonated in a different way. Mentally, however, I was in a state of constant turmoil. My thoughts fluctuated between trying to rationalize what I had experienced and accepting that perhaps there was more to the universe than my scientific mind was prepared to admit. Every time I closed my eyes, flashbacks of the bright light and peaceful feeling washed over me, leaving me with a deep sense of longing. Evangeline remained by my side throughout my recovery, her face a mixture of relief and concern. She could tell that something fundamental had changed in me, but she waited patiently until I was ready to share. Our children, on the other hand, alternated between treating me as if I were made of glass and bombarding me with questions about what had happened, when I died. It was during a particularly restless night, about a week after the incident, that I finally felt ready to speak. Evangeline was sitting next to me in the hospital bed, holding my hand as she had done every night. I looked at her, seeing the love and understanding in her eyes, and the words began to flow. I told him everything: the feeling of leaving my body, the intense light, the presences I felt, the deep understanding I experienced. I talked about how I saw our life together from a new perspective, how I understood the interconnectedness of all things, and with tears in my eyes, I asked him for forgiveness for all the times I had dismissed his spiritual beliefs and experiences. Evangeline listened silently, tears streaming down her face. When I finished, she hugged me tight and said softly, "Cyrus, I always knew there was more to the universe than we could see. I'm so glad you got to experience it too." In the days that followed, I began to notice subtle changes in my perception of the world. Colors seemed more vibrant, sounds clearer, but the most significant change was internal. The fear of death that had tormented me for so long was gone, replaced by a deep curiosity about the nature of consciousness and reality. I began devouring books about near-death experiences, spirituality, and quantum physics, areas that I would have previously scoffed at. My scientific mind was still struggling to reconcile what I had experienced with my previous understanding of the world, but it was now open to new possibilities. One of the most intriguing things I noticed was the constant presence of a giant blue butterfly. She appeared almost daily, landing in my hospital room window or flying around the garden when I started taking short walks. Evangeline, with her knowing look, smiled every time we saw her. "It's a symbol of transformation," she said, and for once, I was inclined to agree. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the magnitude of the change that had occurred in me became increasingly evident. My physical recovery progressed quickly, surprising doctors and nurses, but it was the inner transformation that really haunted me. My perception of time had changed drastically. Moments that would previously have gone unnoticed now seemed loaded with meaning. Watching the sunrise, hearing my children laugh, feeling the breeze on my face, each experience became an opportunity to connect with something bigger than myself. My career, which was once the center of my life, began to lose its primary importance. It wasn't that I had lost interest in science. On the contrary, my scientific curiosity was sharper than ever, but now I saw it as just one of many ways of understanding the universe, not the only or even the most important. I started meditating regularly, something I would have previously considered a waste of time. To my surprise, I found that these moments of stillness allowed me to access that sense of peace and connection that I experienced during my near-death experience. It wasn't that intense, but it was a constant reminder that there was more to reality than what our physical senses can perceive. My relationship with Evangeline has blossomed in ways I never would have imagined possible. Our conversations, once often tense when it came to spirituality, now became deep explorations of ideas and experiences. I began to value her intuition and sensitivity in a way I never had before. At work, my colleagues noticed the change. Some were intrigued, others suspicious. I began to incorporate ethical and philosophical considerations into my neuropathology studies, something I would have previously considered irrelevant. I proposed new research projects that sought to better understand the nature of consciousness and its relationship to the physical brain. One of the most profound changes was my attitude toward death. The fear that once consumed me had been replaced by serene acceptance. Not that I wanted to die, far from it. But now I saw death not as the end, but as a transition. This completely changed the way I approached my work with dying patients and their families. The blue butterfly continued to appear regularly, sometimes when I least expected it. I began to see it as a gentle reminder of my rebirth, a confirmation that the transformation I was going through was real and ongoing. There were moments of doubt, of course. Moments when my former skeptical self tried to rationalize everything that had happened. But then I would remember the feeling of peace and understanding I experienced, and those doubts would dissipate. I realized that I was living a much richer and fuller life. My relationships deepened, my appreciation for the beauty of the world around me intensified, and my quest for knowledge expanded beyond the limits I had previously imposed. The transformation journey was not easy. It required me to question deeply held beliefs, face fears and prejudices I didn't even know I had. But each challenge, each moment of doubt or confusion, seemed to bring me to a new level of understanding and acceptance. As time passed, I began to feel a calling to share my experience and the lessons I had learned. Initially, I hesitated, As a respected scientist, I feared that speaking openly about a near-death experience would damage my professional credibility, but something inside me insisted that this story needed to be told. I started slowly, sharing my experience with small groups of trusted colleagues. To my surprise, many were more open to listening than I expected. Some even shared their own inexplicable experiences, stories they had kept secret for fear of ridicule. Gradually, my circle expanded. I began lecturing not only on neuropathology, but also on the intersection of science and spirituality. I spoke about the need for a more holistic approach to medicine, which considered not only the physical body, but also the emotional and spiritual aspects of the human being. My new perspective also profoundly influenced my research. I initiated a longitudinal study of near-death experiences, combining rigorous neurological analyses with a more open approach to participants' subjective experiences. This work, although controversial in some circles, began to gain attention and respect. At home, I watched my children flourish with this new approach to life. Our conversations became deeper and more meaningful. I began teaching them about meditation and mindfulness, tools I wished I had discovered much earlier in life. Evangeline, always my biggest supporter, encouraged me to write a book about my experience and the changes it brought about in my life and worldview. The writing process was cathartic and eye-opening, forcing me to examine every aspect of my journey with a new level of clarity. As my book gained attention, I began to receive invitations to speak at conferences and television shows. Suddenly, I found myself in the position of being a bridge between the scientific and spiritual worlds, something I would never have imagined possible a few years earlier. Not everything was easy, of course. I faced skepticism and even hostility from some colleagues who saw my new work as a betrayal of scientific principles. But for every critical voice, there were many others who found comfort and inspiration in my story. One of the most rewarding aspects of this new chapter in my life was the opportunity to work with terminally ill patients. My near-death experience has given me a unique perspective on the dying process, allowing me to offer comfort and understanding in a way that would not have been possible before. I saw the fear in these patients, eyes turned to acceptance and even curiosity about what might come next. Throughout this process, my relationship with science evolved. I didn't abandon her, far from it. Instead, I began to see science as a powerful but limited tool for understanding reality. I learned to balance scientific rigor with an openness to experiences and phenomena that we cannot yet fully explain. The blue butterfly continued to appear at key moments, as a silent reminder of the extraordinary journey I was on. Every time I saw her, I felt a rush of gratitude for the second chance I had been given. Over time, I realized that my purpose had expanded far beyond my original career path. Now I saw my role as that of an explorer, navigating the boundaries between science and spirituality, and sharing what I learned along the way. Now, years after that fateful day on the Arkansas River, I look back and barely recognize the man I was. Dr. Cyrus Blackwood, the inveterate skeptic, the scientist who believed he had all the answers, seems like a completely different person. My near-death experience not only changed my outlook on death, it fundamentally transformed my understanding of life. I learned that life is much richer, more mysterious and interconnected than I ever imagined. Each day became an opportunity to explore, learn, and grow. One of the most profound lessons I've learned is about the nature of fear. The fear of death that haunted me for so long was actually a fear of living fully. By facing death head-on, I paradoxically gained a much greater appreciation for life. My relationship with Evangeline has blossomed in ways I never would have imagined possible. Your patience and unconditional love during my transformation journey were fundamental. Today, we share a deep connection that transcends the physical, a partnership that extends to the spiritual. Professionally, I found a new balance. I continue my work in neuropathology, but now with a broader perspective. My research into near-death experiences and altered states of consciousness has gained international recognition, opening new frontiers in understanding the human mind. But perhaps the most significant change was in my perception of time and purpose. Each moment gained new depth and meaning. I learned to value not only the big accomplishments, but also the small moments of beauty and connection that previously went unnoticed. The blue butterfly, which has become a constant symbol of my transformation, still appears from time to time. Every time I see her, I am reminded of the incredible journey I have been on and continue to be on. Looking to the future, I'm not sure what awaits me. But one thing is certain. I am no longer afraid. Whatever comes after this life, I know it is part of something bigger, something beautiful and deeply meaningful. For those reading my story, I leave this advice. Don't wait for a near-death experience to start living fully. Life is precious. Every moment is an opportunity to grow, love, and marvel at the mystery of the universe. My journey has taught me that true wisdom comes not from having all the answers, but from being open to all the questions. That science and spirituality are not adversaries, but partners in the search for truth. And that love, in all its forms, is the most powerful and transformative force we know. As I write these final words, I look out the window and see the blue butterfly perched on a nearby branch. I smile, knowing that my journey of discovery and transformation is far from over. In fact, I feel like it's just beginning. And so, I conclude this report not with a full stop, but with reticence. For life, in all its beauty and mystery, continues to unfold in ways we could never imagine. If you liked this beautiful spiritual testimony, leave a like, comment on your impressions, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to activate the notification bell to watch each new video and help us spread this message to a greater number of people. Until next time.